Good evening, Dr. Robinson and Professor Robinson.
Good evening, Minister Brown.
We are fortunate to be here in the home of Dr.
Edward Robinson.
Edward Robinson.
In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Dr. Robinson, maybe you'll tell us a little bit about yourself. Introduce us to you and your brother, and tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing and a little bit about your background.
Well, we're a group of miseducated black folk, as 99% of so-called educated black folk are miseducated, because if you don't learn anything about the beauty, grandeur, and sophistication of your ancestors, then you're miseducated. I don't care how many degrees you have. We have several degrees. I'm a lawyer. I have a law degree, and I have all kinds of degrees, just proving that until you learn about Akhenaten, until you learn about Khufu, until you learn about Sunni Ali Bir, until you learn about the great masters of mathematics and astronomy of thousands of years ago who were black people, then you're miseducated. White people, fortunately for their children, they are taught about Galileo and Plato and Aristotle and the greatness of their European background. But we're not. So I was very happy to be introduced to my ancestors after I had accomplished 4 degrees. And that's when I started becoming educated. I practiced law in my company, which was a multi-million-dollar life insurance company. And my brother and I had, with a group of black people, had built a little company up to a multi-million-dollar level. And that was because our ancestors guided us, and we relied on our ancestors to guide us to success. We formed an organization called the Pan-African Federation Organization. My brother did. He's primary person who built this, Professor Robinson, Professor Calvin Robinson, who not only helped build with a group of us a multi-million-dollar life insurance company, but he also formed this organization called the Pan-African Federation Organization, the purpose of which is to spread the good news about the greatness and the beauty and grandeur and sophistication of our African ancestors. That's the purpose of the organization. Now, we spread that information by teaching classes, and my brother, Professor Calvin Robinson, has organized many classes throughout Philadelphia, New Jersey, Delaware, New York, to teach this great story. He also wrote a book called The Journey of the Songhai People, which is considered by black historians as the foundational book for African and African-American history. It's called by Molefi Asante as being the basic book that all black people should own in order to get the real story of who we are. See, there are 2 kinds of history. One is cultural history, and that is the history of what happened thousands of years ago and what happened last year. That's cultural history. Then there's a physical history, and this physical history goes into why we have different colors, why we have different hair, why we have different features. And this is physical history. And this is what we've been guided by our ancestors to tell the children of the Sun people, and we are the Sun people, these are the African people, that they have been looked down upon, knowing that our color and our hair are symbols of advanced.
Dr. Robinson?
Yes, sir.
That's magnificent. And you say, unless we know our history, we cannot really know who we are?
Not only that, we can never reach the potential that God has put into us. We'll never be the right students. Children can never reach the height of their academic proficiency. They can never reach the height of their behavior unless they know their African history. I'm saying it as clear and plain as I can. Not African American. African history.
Can you tell us why this is so? A lot of people say
There's a rule.
they don't feel that it's necessary.
I know, yeah. A lot of people back in Columbus's day didn't feel that the earth was round. They thought it was flat. And somebody come around saying the earth is round, they say, I don't think it's important to know.
Or you're crazy.
Or you're crazy. The reason is of a law, and the law is called a territorial imperative. And that territorial imperative was followed down through the thousands of years. And it comes down to a maxim called, honor thy ancestors of the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. And the land giveth to black people is Africa, not America. In the Bible, there are 8 references, scriptural references, to that you have to honor the ancestors of the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. We know that, you know that. In fact, when you say the 10 Commandments, when you get to the 5th commandment, which is the only commandment with a promise. And that commandment says, honor thy father and thy mother, which means thy ancestors, so that thy days will be long. It gives you a promise.
Correct.
And also implies that if you don't honor your ancestors, your days will be short. Now, who has the shortest days in America? Black folk. Because we do not honor our African ancestors.
Yes.
Oh, they can give you all the Marion Andersons and Booker T. Washington. They're great people. But they're the icing on the cake. The cake is Africa. You don't ever think about eating just the icing. Eat both. And they have denied us the cake. Now, why? Well, the reason why, and how they did it was very, very clever. Very clever. In 1712, a man came to America. His name was Willie Lynch.
Yes.
And Willie Lynch told the plantation owners of the South, if you want to control these black folks, you got to stop allowing them to practice their history and teaching their history to their children. Well, they didn't pay him much mind. And our fathers and mothers revolted and fought back, burned his houses and ran away and did all kinds of things. And they were prisoners of war.
Yes.
They were never slaves, prisoners of war. They said, we call them slaves and make them feel bad. That's how you make them feel bad, by calling them slaves. The word slave comes from a word Slav, which are the Czechoslovakians, the Yugoslavians, which were the Slavic people of Eastern Europe that were captured by the Romans as status symbols. They were called Slavs, and eventually that word became slave. But that was relating to the Slavic people. We produced capital. They never produced capital. We produced the cotton. We built houses. We did all the ironworks there you see in New Orleans. We produced capital. We were prisoners of war, made to labor under guns. So there are 8 references that you have to honor your ancestors. Well, in 1795, a group of plantation owners from South Carolina and Virginia went to Germany to consult with a man whose name was Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And Blumenbach said, I know why you all are having trouble with those black folks over there. The reason is you don't cut off the knowledge of their African ancestors. And they said, well, how can we do that? How can we cut off the knowledge of the African? Because the mama and daddy is going to tell the children all about Akhenaten, all the Khufu. They're going to tell them about the greatness of their Kemetan or Egyptian background. They're going to tell all about the great university cities of Shanghai from which we took them. And Blumenbach laughed, and he said, well, it's simple. There's a way to do that. And they'll never be able to learn about it. And they said, well, how do you do that? Because the mom and dad are going to tell the children. He said, what you do, as soon as a boatload of them arrives over here from Africa, you take the babies out their mama's and daddy's arms and raise the babies on distant plantations where they'll never hear about who they are. They'll never hear it. And that way, you've cut it off. So when those children grow up, they can't tell their children that they came from a beautiful city called Timbuktu. They can never tell their children they came from a beautiful city called Janne, a city considered by world travelers the most beautiful city in the world for 300 years, from 1300 all the way up to 1700. They can never tell their children that they came from university cities because they were babies when they were snatched out of their mama's and daddy's arms. And that's why black people can't even tell what country they came from. They can tell what continent, Africa. But you take 500 black people and say, all right, what city in Africa did you come from? They can't tell you. Can't tell you. Why? Because their grandparent was snatched out their mama's arms when they were babies. So once we did that, then these children taught them who they were. These children in all these schools that we have demonstrated the accuracy of what we're talking about. Those children went from C's and D's to B pluses and A's.
You're saying just knowing?
Just knowing it.
History?
Just knowing it.
Yeah.
Just
So I might intercede here for a split minute, and that is that the way in which the brainwashing has been perpetrated against us, too many of us feel, though, that our history is not important. But if you go back to Akhenaten, go back and learn that he was interested in trying to teach our people their history. And we find that a man, Senator Cicero, who was a Roman senator, and he found that during this period of time that at one time we knew our history. So he came to the conclusion that there was very little that was more important than for any people to know their history, their language, their culture, and tradition. For without such knowledge, one stands naked and before the world. And what are some more of the things, as Dr. Robinson had just told us here about the greatness of our people? That mathematics, by the astronomer priestess, they were known as a special breed of women. They had a particular name. They were called Typhonians. They were a special breed of people.
4,700 years ago.
Right, 4,700 years ago. And they created the science of geometry, trigonometry, and calculus. And that's why our men at that time, our brothers at that time, were able to build the pyramid. But today, the European has usurped this information to themselves, plagiarizing in many ways, putting out motion pictures or putting out documentaries, so-called documentaries, and implying that the blacks were not the original people and that it was the Arabs. Now, just recently here in this war between Iraq and the United States, that right after the war it was supposed to have been concluded, which really that country is really known as Persia in the Bible. And that they said that the cradle of civilization was in Persia. That's the biggest lie they ever told. Biggest lie they ever told. And I don't mind telling them. So therefore, we have to be diligent in putting forth our information, because if we don't do that, then it will seem as though that we are not sure of ourselves, that we don't know what we're doing. We gotta let the world know that we know our history. Now we know that all of us aren't gonna know it. Only the chosen few. When I say chosen few, I don't mean somebody went around and chose them, but it's like the cream coming to the top in a quart of milk. Those people who have been touched by the universe, by the Creator, to have that special interest, that special feeling of commanding, are the ones who's going to do that. And you will know them by their fruits. You know them by their fruit. It's always those 10%, actually it's about 2.5 to 3%, who are really the nucleus of this 10%. Now the 3%, 2.5 to 3%, galvanize the 10% into doing what has to be done. And this is what happened during the period of our bondage when we were in chains here in this country. A man by the name of Denmark Vesey and his buddy, his right hand, his lieutenant, Peter Poyas, they spent the first 5 years of their trying to organize our people. But first, before they organized them, or tried to organize them, they agitated them. They played the role of agitator. They did that in order to make them angry, to make them come to the senses. You know, like a lot of times if somebody implies that you are too bright, this, that, the other, well, you want to show these people, hey, I'm not what you say I am. But it didn't work, because that 90% of our people mind is inculcated into the philosophy of their detractors, which are our enemies. But it was over 4 million, slightly over 4 million, maybe 4 million and some, of our people in captivity at that time. And 10% of that, rounded off roughly, was about 500,000. And it was about 500,000 that fought in the Civil War. Some fought as soldiers, some fought as spies and labor battalions, and different other jobs that were necessary to prosecute the war in the way it should have been for victory, not for white people per se, but just to save the Union, because everything could have been changed if this had not happened. I believe Providence had a hand in that.
One of the things that we that precipitated this discussion, I believe, was that you heard a cassette tape in which I spoke for an organization named MATA, in which I proved that the people we call...
I want Dr. Robinson to go into something that he came upon, which has set the scientific world of white geneticists into a fit. Dr. Robinson, I'd like for you to talk about the DNA theory.
Yes. A few years ago, my brother and I read a book called The Mark of Oppression. And these two publishers, Cardiner and Oversee, said that they could not understand how is it that a group of people, African Americans, have been bludgeoned over their heads mentally and spiritually for hundreds of years and are still surviving. They couldn't understand it, and they said so in their book. The answer came out in 1996, why it is that not only have African Americans survived the worst mental and spiritual bludgeoning of any people in recorded history, but they are becoming champions of everything in which there is a level playing field. No matter what it is, we predominate in every field. This is why they won't teach our children African history, because they know that once our children get on the same level playing field as their white counterparts, that they will dominate just like we dominate in basketball, baseball, football, track and field, and anything else in which there is a level playing field. So that while they teach their children about the greatness of their European ancestors, they won't teach our children about the greatness of their African ancestors, because then that would be a level playing field in academia. And they know that we will predominate, just like all of these examples we've given them, that our children predominate when they know who they are from the African historical point of view. Now, here's what I found out in 1996. A group of geneticists wrote this book.
When you
Little
said
tiny
group of
pen. Geneticists.
Can you identify where they're from and
The group.
how it came about?
Yeah,
for them to
okay.
do this study?
All right, sure. Yes, indeed. An organization is called the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The American Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, this organization is composed of people who study about DNA and the genome. And you've been reading about the DNA and the genomes. Well, this group of scientists came upon an idea by accident at first that different groups of people had different numbers of DNA series.
Explain that.
Now, a DNA series means that when your DNA is located, and say they get a hair from your head and they subject it to certain tests, they say, well, this is the DNA of Minister Brown, and yours is different from everybody else in the world. All right? Then they found further that not only are their DNA series different, but the number of DNAs in there are different in different groups. Whites have a different number of DNA, and blacks have a different number of DNA series. Apes have a different number of DNA series. Then they found this amazing thing, that the greater the number of DNA series, the smarter the person, the group is, the greater the probability of genius within that group. So they tested the orangutans, these 15 geneticists from around the world. Now, these geneticists came from 9 different universities. And we have here on the cover of the pamphlet they put out the names of these geneticists. And you can see them right there, right beneath the title of this pamphlet. Now, this pamphlet, most people have no idea what it means. But breaking it down, and after you study it and have it explained to you by a geneticist, a trained geneticist, you will find that they're talking about DNA series. Now, here are the names of these 15 geneticists from around the world: University of Japan, University of China. Yale University is the headquarters of this organization called the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And you see it down there. Now, this was copyrighted in 1996. All right. What it said is this, and this is the mind-blowing part. It said that when they tested the orangutan, they found out he only had 3 DNA series. When they tested the gorilla, they found that the gorilla has 4 DNA series, because he's a little smarter than the orangutan. They tested the chimpanzee, which is an ape, and found that he had 5 DNA series. Then they went all into the different races of the world. They went into Europe and tested the DNA series of the English, the French, the German, the Spanish, the Russians, and found they had 6 DNA series. Then they put all of this, what they found from around the world, on a map. And this map really is called the intelligence map of the world, because they tested 116 different human groups and found their DNA series numbers. All of them, all over the world, have 6. And they put the numbers in form of a little flag that you can see on this map. These little flags have a color. And they show, oh, this is upside down. I'm sorry. Yeah. And they showed that the English have only 6, and all into Europe, only 6. Went over into Japan and China, and they only have 6. Over into America, which is predominantly European, and they only have 6. Then they came to Africa, and they came to the part of Africa. Now, all the rest of them, they put in little flag colors. Those flag colors are orange, red, if you notice. But when you come to Africa, found out that the African people have 9 DNA series from here just below the Shanghai Empire down to the foot of Africa. All those 10 nations, of which African Americans descended from one of them. We have 9 DNA series, the greatest possibility of genius in our group. Now it's answered this age-old question. How can a people survive being told they're nothing for 400 years, never allowed to learn that they came from beautiful cities and told they came from a jungle? How could a people survive? How can a people become champions in everything they touch? Because they have 9 DNA series, while the rest of the world has only 6. This is why they copyrighted this. And you'll notice on the outside of this, now this map is taken, I took this map right from this page here. And I blew it up so that the world could see it. Even though this is copyrighted, I can't let you have this book because it's copyrighted.
Can you give us the title of the book?
The title of the book is called Global Patterns of Linkage, Disequilibrium at the CD4 Locus and Modern Human Origins. Global Patterns of Linkage, Disequilibrium at the CD4 Locus and Modern Human Origins. Now, you have to be a geneticist to even know what they're talking about. But when we broke it down and interviewed Dr. Kidd, the head, he's the chairman at Yale University. We broke it down into plain, everyday English so that the world would know that the African American is descended from those people who gave to the world the Great Pyramid, gave to the world science, gave to the world mathematics. A black man named Ahmose gave algebra to the world 3,700 years ago. It's in the world books, it's in the encyclopedias. They don't want our children to know this, because then that would make the playing field level for white children. And you know what happens when they made the playing field level in basketball and allowed black men to play. Out of 29 of the top-seeded players in the world today, 28 are African American. When they opened up the Penn relays, when they opened up the Olympics and allowed blacks to run back in 1932, we've won all the gold medals. And the same thing will happen in the classroom when they allow our children to learn their African history. That's what this is saying.
Dr. Robinson,
Mm-hmm.
are you saying that the African American also has 9 strands of DNA?
I am saying that we are descended from the West Africans who have 9 DNA series. On this map, that these geneticists, you see the green down here?
Yes.
Well, that's where we're from. That's where African Americans are from.
Did they test African Americans also?
They couldn't, they tested Americans as a group, whites, and they have 6. They didn't test African Americans because they know that we are the same people from West
Oh,
Africa.
so they didn't have to?
Didn't have to.
Okay, that's true.
That's true.
How is it that you think that this evolved, that we evolved with 9 strands
9.
below the Sahara?
Well, it tells you in here. This book tells why. Preemie babies, leaving the mother's womb early, too early, never develop to the same height that a baby that runs a full term. Right?
Yes.
White folks in the China, all mankind arose in Africa. All mankind arose in this part of Africa, right here. It's called the womb of Africa. That's the womb of Africa over here. Right there.
Between the Middle East and...
No.
Gorge.
That Kenya.
Uganda.
Yeah, that area. All mankind arose there. The great-granddaddies of white folks, great-granddaddies of Chinese, great-granddaddies of Japanese, our great-granddaddies, all of us looked the same. All looked like apes. That was called Australopithecus. I don't know how technical you want me to get. Australopithecus was the granddaddy, great-great-granddaddy of all races. Now, they left the womb 800,000 years ago. Whites left the womb and wandered up into Europe, and the Chinese wandered over into Asia. And they left the womb before they were fully developed. That's why they did not develop melanin like we did. Those of us who stayed developed full term. They never developed the melanin stimulating hormone. This is why we're the only race on the planet that does not have head lice in our hair.
Head lice.
Head lice. They are little bugs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cooties, right.
Cooties. We're the only race on the planet because we developed full term. We lost our straight hair, that animal hair, over 150,000 years ago. You see, all other races have head lice because they never developed fully. Melanin is this magical chemical that is developed on the 5th layer of the epidermis of your skin. Now, we've been brainwashed to believe that the less melanin you have, the prettier you are, because that's the brainwash.
Yes.
That's like saying a naked person is prettier than a person with beautiful clothes on. If you get what I'm trying to say, the scenario, yeah. Melanin heals. When you cut yourself, the melanin rushes to the surface of your skin and forms a scab. What color is that scab? I don't care what color. Brown, dark brown.
Right.
That's the melanin
Right.
coming up to heal you. This is why we do not get skin cancer, because of the melanin prevents it. The only place where we can get skin cancer, we learned it in the inquiry today, is on the palm of the hand and the fingers. And can't believe we'd be putting our hand up to the sun to get skin cancer.
Can you talk a little bit more about this hair and the light? What are you saying about African hair?
Oh, what am I saying? That's a good question.
Because,
Okay.
you know, we spend a lot of time straightening it and frying it and cooking it.
And the question is why? The reason why is because we've been programmed to believe that our hair is ugly. And as a result of the ruby comb.
Oh, the ruby comb.
Mm-hmm. Oh, here it is. And the reason why is we want, on the plantation, our mothers and fathers were programmed to believe that we were ugly. The white man said, look, you're ugly. So we thought that everything he had was good. So that's why they called our hair bad. So whenever you are raised up to believe that what you got is bad, you're going to have an inferiority complex, and you're not going to perform on high a level as God gave you the gift to perform. Well, white folks have this big problem of head lice. That's the bugs, and all animals do. The ape has to groom himself all day long, picking the bugs out of their hair. Why? Because he has straight hair. Straight hair is animal hair. And therefore, our women spend $15 billion a year to have hair that has head lice. But fortunately, it goes down to the roots. Your straight hair has to come from the root, because the straight hair comes through a round follicle, not an elliptical follicle like human hair, like our hair does. So we've been programmed to believe that. Now, what I have here, right here, is a picture of a robicomb. Now, what is a robicomb? Well, a few years ago, they found that the pesticides that they were using on straight hair to kill the head lice was losing its effectiveness. If you go into a drugstore, I don't know if you all have Rite Aid in New York. Well, you go into Rite Aid and you say, where's the counter for the head lice? They'll point you over to a counter where they have all kinds of pesticide listed. And they have 19 types of chemicals. But these chemicals are losing their effectiveness, they're losing their power. So the scientists went to the laboratory and came up with an electronic comb called a robicomb. And here's a picture of it right here. Now, the robicomb kills the head lice electronically, and you hear it, it goes zap, zap, zap. You can hear it when it kills a louse. That's one louse. And it kills another louse and combs it out of the head, and also kills the nits. Now, we have a word in the English language called nit picking. That means picking the nits out of here. Now, what are nits? Nits are little white capsules that can hold the eggs of the lice.
Right.
So nit picking is taking charge of little tiny things. And that's a little tiny thing that they get out their heads. Nit picking. So when I made that cassette tape, said we are the supreme remnant of the most advanced people on the planet, I was saying that knowing that we came with 9 DNA series. So we start off better.
Can I ask you one question?
Oh, you asked me a gang of questions.
When did the 9 strands evolve?
Well, all right, let's go back.
All right.
Let's go back. That's a good question. Yeah. Okay. 2 million years ago, Australopithecus, that's all was on Earth, the great-great-granddaddy of all human beings. And he was about 3 DNA series. And then as the millions of years went on, he evolved into what is known as Homo erectus. Now, he had about 3.5 DNA series. They're about the level of the orangutan. If you look at the orangutan today, you could see what our ancestors looked like 2.5 million years ago, because he has the same golden hair as Europeans' hair right today. The orangutan. You've heard of the orangutan over there in India? Huh? Now, maybe this is a little too rough for your audience, and you're going to get bombarded out of your place and station, because white folks don't like to hear this at all. I'm sorry. You can edit
They've
that.
already done the research,
We
correct?
fight. This was done by white folks.
This was done by white folks.
It's not a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't do it.
Sure didn't.
We
They
didn't do
wanted
it.
to determine
And
the
here's the names of the people. I don't know how. Now I made you a copy,
Oh,
a,
wonderful.
a copy of the
Believe me, I'm going to take it
of the
and
head.
put it right up
Yeah.
there.
Here's a copy of the front piece with all, and a copy of the back page with all the references where you can find it.
Oh, that is excellent.
So maybe you can take that with you.
Yes.
Yeah, because the inside is what was copyrighted.
Dr. Robinson,
Yeah.
why do you think the research was done? Was it to determine the intellectual difference?
They
between
thought
Africans?
they thought it was going to come out differently.
Oh,
That's why they copyrighted it. You ain't heard nothing about it, have
no.
you?
That's why you have it.
That's why you have it. They
So they didn't publish this.
no, they ain't gonna publish it.
Oh, so they copyrighted it to keep it from being
Now you got it.
That's exactly
published.
Now you got it. Well, of course.
Okay.
You see, they went at it. I was paid $9,000 a couple years ago to write up what is known as a tricontinental racial evolution. In other words, what was happening only on cultural stuff? What was happening 50,000 years ago in Europe? What was happening 40,000 years ago in Europe? 30,000. What was happening 50,000 years ago in Africa? What was happening 40,000 years, 30,000, 20,000, 10,000? A timeline, it's called.
Correct.
Now, this national corporation thought, when they gave me the assignment, they thought that it would prove that the Europeans were so far ahead of Africans that would be no argument. They didn't know that when I got and handed them the findings with 37 books, 28 written by whites, just the opposite. That 44,000 years ago, we had civilizations.
44,000.
44,000.
And beyond.
Iron and steel manufacturing, cities and universities, 44,000 years ago. Well, the Europeans' first book was written 2,800 years ago, 42,000 years later. And that book was by a man named Homer.
And he didn't write it.
It's a poem. It's a poem.
He couldn't have written it because Greeks had no alphabet. 28,000.
No, 2,800. Yeah,
They had no alphabet.
well,
They had no alphabet until
they did.
Kemetic people
No,
adopted.
Homer wrote the book. Now, there's no question
All
about
right,
that.
I
So,
know.
yeah.
I can't get information from you.
And but the first book written in Europe was only 2,800 years ago. We had universities 44,000 years ago. I mean,
It's a moot point to argue.
yeah.
Give it to him.
Now, okay, then.
You were talking about the evolutionary process.
Yeah. So
You were-
2.5. Oh yeah. So as the hundreds of thousands of years went by, we acquired. I mean, all mankind acquired more and more. But those who left Africa 800,000 years ago did not get past 6 DNA series. They had left the womb. The womb is Africa. That's where you develop. Just like in the mother's womb. The baby can't develop to his full potential outside the womb. That's why preemies have such a hard, those babies born prematurely, they're called preemies.
Yeah, Professor Robinson. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Robinson.
Oh,
One of the things that was noted, especially in the northern United States, was that most black or African young women who are bearing children are told that they have to have cesarean sections, which are C-sections. And these children are usually taken from the womb prior to its natural
Revolution.
revolution,
Yeah,
9 months.
That's right.
Do you think that there may be some correlation between that developmental process with respect to the DNA, the 9-DNA, or maybe there's some secret study being conducted?
I
Research?
really don't know. This is, one thing I've learned is that, that
Intellectual guess.
when you make an intellectual
Yes.
guess, knowing how we have always been used as experimental subjects, I would guess that these black women were subjected to this C-section in order to improve how they did this for white women. That's how I believe. That's what I believe. I would believe that until somebody shows me differently. But we've always been used for experimental purposes. One more thing I want to make sure that I get this in. I have here in my hand a book. It's the oldest complete book written by man in the world, in history. This is a copy of that book. This is what we teach our children. That this book, which is not the oldest book that's ever been written by Africans, but it's the oldest complete book found. And this book is written 2,300 BC, before Christ. That's like 4,400 years ago, 4,400 years ago. This is a copy of the book. It's written by a man whose name was Ptah-hotep. And these are called the teachings of Ptah-hotep, written 4,400 years ago. And they found a very interesting introduction by those men who got the copy as soon as it was translated from ancient Kemetic language into English. One of the names of the man, his name is Asa G. Hilliard from the State University of Georgia, and Harry Williams. These are historians who go into this. But I just want to show you how it feels to be reading a book written by a man 110 years old, who was 110 years old 4,400 years ago. So this is what we teach our children.
What's the geographical origin of this book?
Egypt, ancient Egypt. We call it Kemet.
That's the real name.
That's the real name.
Dr. Robinson, before you go, I would like for you to give us your impression or your insight as to what these 9 DNA strands mean spiritually. Because I have a feeling that it has a relationship to a spiritual dimension that we are not aware of.
Yes, sir. I agree. And oh, I thought you were looking at
Oh, no, I
something.
thought you said about horn blowing.
No. After you reach a certain level of intelligence, it's more than just knowing how to figure, how to mathematically calculate the distance from here to a star. For instance, most of you have heard of the metric system, where New York is a certain number of kilometers from Philadelphia, and you see on road signs how many kilometers it is to the next town, and how many miles it is to the next town, and so on. Well, the metric system is based on a meter, A meter is a certain length called, the meter is 39.37 inches. Now, where did that come from? Well, it came from the pyramid, because inside of the pyramid was a granite slab that was found by a Frenchman whose name was Abbe Morio. And on the back of this granite slab was the inscription in hieroglyphics saying that this represented 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole, calculated by our fathers and mothers 5,200 years ago, and was put on a slab and put into the pyramid, which is only 4,600 years old. So it was kept 600 years and put inside of the pyramid. From that, Abbe Morio, who found it, created the metric system, because that's a fixed distance, the distance from the North Pole to the equator, calculated by black people 5,200 years ago. So I say to my teachers and the heads of the departments in Philadelphia, heads of the school system, why don't you teach this to African children, African American children, that their fathers invented the metric system? Why? And they hang their heads. And the reason they hang their heads, because they didn't know. They didn't know where it came from. 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator. They didn't know that calculus, geometry, and trigonometry came from 3 black women. I always say black women are the smartest people in the world.
Yeah.
They didn't know that algebra came from a black man 3,700 years ago named Amos. And it's in the World Book. They put it there. Right? But why don't you teach our children that? Because that would make them on a level playing field, and they would outdo your children every time. Every time.
So you're saying the reason our children, and I want you to go back to that spiritual question, but you may incorporate that in this answer, that our children are diminished because of lack of knowledge of themselves. And without knowledge of yourself, there's something in you that you can't activate.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that. It's exactly right what you're saying. But it's even worse than that. Because it's all right not to know, but to know wrongfully that you are less than human. You see, it isn't that we weren't taught something. We were taught negative things about ourselves. It's not knowing. It's knowing the wrong thing about yourself. And being taught the wrong thing. But that's still not all. The white folks were taught the wrong things about us too, and their hatred and their contempt also has an effect on us. Because to be hated by the dominant group is just like a child in school being hated by the teacher. The dominant person in that room diminishes his intelligence, diminishes his ability to create, diminishes his ability to solve mathematical problems. You see, to be hated has a physiological impact on you. To being despised. Now, W.B. Du Bois said it affects everybody except the talented 10th. Now, the talented 10th, and we don't believe it's 10%. We think it's about 2%. My Professor Robinson has calculated it's about 2% of us are rise above the hatred, rise above being hated, and we can calculate this. This is where our geniuses come from that little tiny 2%. But suppose we were 90%, look, we would have solved the problem of cancer by now, solved the problem of AIDS. If our being were allowed to flourish. Now I'm going to get back to what you're saying about the spiritual aspect. We calculate, Professor Robinson and Brother Battle, have you ever seen our book called The Journey to Song High People?
No, but I want to see it before I leave. I want to get a copy.
All right.
Awesome.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We have it. Professor Battle and my brother Calvin wrote the book. I added to it. And they have calculated, he and Professor Battle have calculated, that once you get above 7 DNA series, then you enter the spiritual realm. And this spiritual realm allows you to experience things that people on a lower level of intelligence can't experience. Like we can experience something like people with only 6 DNA series, like a European, they can experience things that the ape can't experience. Well, just like they're only 1 above a chimpanzee, we're 3 above him.
And the difference between a chimpanzee and man is astronomical.
Well,
And
actually,
he's only 1.
That's only 1. He's only 1. See, I wouldn't even be bragging. This is why why do you think, look down at the bottom here. What does it say?
It's upside down.
Yeah. What does it say down at the bottom? Copyright.
Yes. Yes. 1996.
That's right.
By American. I can't quite make that out, but you.
Associations for Advancement of Science.
Yes.
There it is. And I'm going to give you a copy of this page. I can't give you the book because it's copyrighted. And Dr. Kidd sent me the book. He's the head. He's the head of this organization.
Does it have a Library of Congress number?
Man, I don't think they would put that down there in the Library of Congress.
Could be doing this opposite of what they want.
Right.
I don't believe they would. I don't believe they would. Let me see. I don't see it.
But I don't want you to get off that spiritual.
Yeah, now here's what happened. No. Mm-mm.
They just put that as copyright.
That's all. Yep.
Can you get another one? I stopped. Professor, could you please continue to elaborate on the spiritual? Dr. Robinson, would you?
And I think that once, and Professor Robinson Calvin, Professor Calvin Robinson and Brother Battle have examined this possibility that Ma'at, which is the spiritual foundation of our mothers and fathers, reaching back over 10,000 years. This is our way of life. Some people call it, that was our religion. Well, you see, religion is not the proper term, because this set of laws governed our mothers and fathers in ancient Kemet and in Shanghai to become not only great scientists, but also were unbeaten, unconquered for thousands of years. We were the leaders of the world in science and humaneness and letters and all types of things. No other group can ever build the pyramid. Japan tried it in 1974, but their spiritual development wasn't high enough to do it. Because after a certain level of intelligence in calculus, when you get above that and into the theory of numbers and into the area, what you were saying about this professor nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, it gets beyond man's engineering, gets beyond man's mathematics as he knows it today. And our fathers and mothers were beyond that. And this way, our pyramid, the Great Pyramid, is 47 stories high. Japan got up to 19 stories and it fell down. America got up to 20 stories and it fell down. Because the weight of those 2.5 ton blocks of stone, if they're not calculated with certain precision, it'll crush everything beneath it. Each one weighs 2.5 tons. Each one. And how many are there in the Great Pyramid?
I think 1,000,000.
1,200,000.
Whoa.
Each one weighing over 2.5 tons.
It's amazing.
Yes. Perhaps you can, because many people just look at the pyramids and they see a a triangle, and you think that
In
all
our
you
book.
got to do is cut the stones triangly and stack them on top of each other. But perhaps you can tell us what the pyramids incorporate and what scientific.
It's an astronomical laboratory. It lets the light in from certain stars, making certain calculations. This is how our fathers and mothers could calculate. We had to mathematically calculate the distance from the North Pole to the equator. 600 years before the pyramid was built. That was the math leading up to it. You see what I'm saying? Now, you don't get that spiritual knowledge, with 6 DNA series. You can't do it with 6. So when, as a father up the road, you get toward 9, then you enter the spiritual realm. And the
modern humans.
Let me deal with the cover page of the extract that I got from the work you did with 16 geneticists from different parts of the country. The extract said the greater the number of DNA series, the greater the probability for genius and creativity. Then it gave, and it has the map and where these samples were taken from, which were all over the planet. And it had 6 DNA series for people for Europeans, and it had 9 DNA series for Africans, and it showed where these samples were taken. You can go ahead on and answer that. I'm just going to let the people. I don't know who they are, but I'm going to see it. I don't want to cut all these cameras off.
Okay.
So you can either wait or you can answer. I can hear you. I'm focusing on you.
How do I want to give a simple example? It's, if you think of a combination of variation that may lead to something in a human that's sort of at the extremes. Let's take Michelangelo and his artistic abilities, Leonardo da Vinci and his abilities to design things as well as be an artist. That's clearly outside the common range. And that's something that will occur maybe more commonly with some amounts of variation than it will with other amounts of variation. So if there's lots of variation, occasionally those extremes will pop up. If there's not a lot of variation, it's hard to get to the extremes because you don't have the variants that generate those extremes.
Now, I hate I went to that door. I missed something. Can I ask you if you repeat something?
Okay, I probably didn't give a very good example. Let's think of piles of sand.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got a little bit of sand, and you pile it up, and of course it'll spread out a little. But then if you've got a lot of sand, and you try to pile it up, it'll spread further.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think that these exceptional people
Mm-hmm.
who are, I hate to say abnormal, but they're sort of out of the range. The Einsteins, the Michelangelos, the Leonardo da Vinci's, and one can go on and on. If you have to get out in this far extreme, if you've only got a little bit of sand, a little bit of variation, you can't get out there. Or very few grains of sand get out there. So if you've got a lot of variation that's useful and contributes to these kinds of exceptions, then the chances that some will come together are better.
Okay.
If you don't have all of those variants that you need, you can never pile all of them up.
When I talk to you over the phone, you use, as an example, Scandinavian population, and most of the people in that population are going to look the same. But if you had an African population, you would have more of a variety because of the... Now, I may have taken this wrong, so I want you to correct me if I did. I took it as the African population, because it said that the Africans that evolved below the Sahara, but then I found out they used that because Northern Africa has a lot of Asians and so forth. So the indigenous population would have been African. So it represented all Africa. But because they had more of the original human, and you're going to have to explain this to me, when you talked about polymorphisms and so forth, that they had more of the genetic material that would go back in time to the first or the primer human, and had not over time lost as much of that genetic material.
That's right.
Okay, can
So-
you explain it? Because I have a problem explaining that, and I want to get a grip on it.
I'll try. I won't guarantee.
All right.
Yes, over time, genetic variation happens. Mutations, small changes. Some of them cause genetic diseases. They're very harmful. And those tend to get selected away because a child born with a serious metabolic disorder doesn't live. But lots of other variation may affect very slightly the width of the nose. Now, there's no reason why that would be harmful. And if that variation is still there, that accumulated over time, then you will see variation in the width of the nose. Now, you said African population. There isn't one African population. There are a lot of them. And they differ. Just like a Japanese can tell the difference between another Japanese and a Chinese. I have terrible trouble doing that. Because I wasn't raised tuned in to the very slight differences. But I would argue, extrapolating based on no special knowledge, that one African tribal group can identify individuals from another tribal group, even though I may say they all look alike.
That's true.
Because I'm not tuned into these very small differences.
That's true. All birds, all blue jays look alike, but some blue jays like other blue jays better.
So I think that's part of it. By the time there's the loss of variation that I talked about expanding out of Africa.
Let me just throw this in here. Could environment, say Africans leaving Africa, going into Europe, and having to survive an environment that was harsh and bitter and cold, develop these variations which are just nature surviving and preparing the people to survive the environment, because they and the environment are one and the same.
So
And nature survives, and it prepares itself for itself to survive.
So, these variations tend they don't generally occur in response to the environment. They need to pre-exist by chance, and then the environment can select them. So, there's variation in skin color. In Africa, dark skin color helps protect against the equatorial harsh sun.
Correct.
Once you get out of Africa, you're further from the equator. The sun is never as intense. And Lord only knows, these days we hardly get much sun here, much less in a place like Northern Europe. So the variation that decreases melanin in the skin allows more sunlight to hit the capillaries and generate vitamin D. And so it becomes more common. And that's necessary to survive. So there's also adult lactose tolerance that is virtually universal in Northern Europe. I clearly have those genes. In essentially all mammal species, the gene that digests lactose is turned off at weaning as part of normal growth and development, because lactose only occurs in mammalian milk. Now, as you're moving into a cold climate, during the long winter, the cow is in the cave or the hut with you, and the baby needs milk. That's fine. But the parents need nutrition too. If they have a better chance of surviving, the baby won't survive if the parents die, if they can also drink the cow's milk. But in most of the world, the gene is turned off in modern humans.
Mhm.
As a Northern European in a very white culture as I was growing up, lactose intolerance was a disorder.
Mhm. Mhm.
We now recognize it as a biologically normal state. We have lactose-free milk because we have a lot of people here who would like to drink milk.
Mhm.
It's nice. But they can't tolerate the lactose because the lactose isn't digested by them into simple sugars, but it is digested by all the bacteria in the gut.
Okay.
And that's not good.
Okay. Yes.
So, if I drink a glass of milk, most of the lactose is digested before the remnants even get out of my stomach.
But if I drink it, I may have a problem.
Yes.
Yes. Can you do me one favor? Can you move your chair over a little bit? Our light source is a little bit more. Our light source has changed. Can you move over? Are you comfortable?
Yeah.
Okay. Good, good, good. Now,
That's.
I'm hoping. No, you want to add something to that?
Oh, I was just going to say, if that's
Thank you.
on, it's no longer pointing at me.
You're absolutely right. Generally, I have somebody working with me. What I would like for you to do is, because I'm not sure that, even though DNA is a common, phrase, but I'm not sure we really understand. I mean, there's just a lot of people. I'm not sure if we really understand what we're talking about when we talk about DNA. Everything has DNA. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So, DNA is a recognizable structure, a recognizable particle of the structure of everything. How can you explain it so everybody will understand what we're talking about when we talk about DNA?
Okay.
Is it like hydrogen? Hydrogen is a integral part of everything.
Right. And it's part of DNA. DNA is a very, in a normal state, it exists in the nucleus of any cell. There's an exception in red blood cells, don't have any DNA. It is digested away as the red cell fills with hemoglobin. But it starts out there. Mm-hmm. And it's very long, and it's composed of repeating units.
Mm.
And it's like a ladder in that there are two strands with connections between the strands. And those connections alternate the different bases, A, T, C, and G.
Mm-hmm.
And they pair. A pairs with T, and C pairs with G.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The result is the machinery in the cell can pull apart the two strands and build a complement to each one. So wherever there was an A here and a T here, it builds a new strand with a T here and an A here. So it restores the pair. A new backbone is formed. So DNA replicates, and it replicates the information, because the order of those four, it's like an alphabet or digital ones and zeros. All of our computers store vast amounts of information with ones and zeros.
Correct.
Here it's four, A, T, G, and C. So a tremendous amount of information can be stored. And the machinery in cells knows how to read that information. There are special signals that say, this is the beginning of the information to make a protein that acts as an enzyme that will digest lactose, for example. And so it comes in and it makes a single copy, and that goes to other machinery that reads it in sets of 3 letters and adds amino acids to make a protein. And there are all sorts of regulatory material that says up here, well, in certain circumstances, we'll turn this gene on. That may come from the environment, or it could be, okay, this kid is now 5 years old and has started growing longer leg bones. And so now's the time to turn this gene off. So it no longer goes through this machinery to make the protein. So it's the blueprint, if you will. It's the instruction booklet. But not a booklet. It's been analyzed to 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica in terms of the information. Because it makes all the proteins, it regulates how they're made, where they're made, when they're made. You don't make red blood cells in your skin, you make them in your bone marrow.
Right.
And you don't make skin cells in your bone marrow. And the same, the bones have cells in them that deposit the bone material, and it has other cells that dissolve it. So bones are constantly being refreshed. So if something happens, you can rebuild the bone, you can sculpt it a little. You can't bend a bone, but if you're a cowboy and you're riding a horse all the time, as the bone is being constantly refreshed, it gets refreshed into bow legs. It's not as though somebody came along and bent the bone. So there's just all of this information, and one could go on with examples forever, but the ability to carry the information and the ability to replicate exactly each of the 2 strands is a template for building the complement. And that's how it passed on from generation to generation. The fertilized egg makes all the millions of cells, but they all have DNA that is essentially identical to what was in that initial fertilized egg.
Now this is very, very interesting. I'm so glad we're having this interview because I'm trying to pull things together as we go along. And we're still trying to understand the 6 strands, 9 strands, and what you're saying in relationship to DNA, what it is, polymorphisms, how does that fit in? And then I'll ask you the question.
Okay, so just to go back to your sentence on strands, I don't think that's related to the DNA structure at all. That's using strand, I think, in a different context. But we'll come back to that.
Explain it? Oh, okay.
Well, I
okay, go
need
ahead.
to talk
the
with you.
polymorphism.
But polymorphism is when a mutation occurs, and this can occur because of an error in replicating. Here's an A, instead of putting a T, somehow it puts in something unusual. And the next time it'll match with a C in that position. Well, that happened once. But now all the DNA that's made from that will have that C in the position rather than an A. But poly, many, morphism form. So now in the population, there are DNA strands that have an A in that position and DNA strands, obviously in different people, that have the T and have the C in that position. So that's all of the variation I was talking about earlier. These are all polymorphisms.
Okay.
So we sometimes refer to them as markers, as variants. They all arose initially as mutations. But a mutation is not necessarily harmful. It depends upon what that bit of DNA does, what it's useful for. So there are polymorphisms, variants that have subtle effects. There are those that have no effect. And I was talking about width of the nose. That has probably many different genes with different polymorphisms as the early fetus is developing. The cells need to proliferate, and there are signals regulating exactly what cell will divide when that are going to alter that. Maybe a little bit, maybe a lot. Some people have very small noses, some people have really big noses. The males in my family, my father and his 2 brothers, had very big noses.
That's going all the way back to them African genes that you brought with you.
Well,
You had a larger pool of selection. But you said that all of the different species of humanity evolved first in Africa and then moved out of Africa, that they all evolved first in Africa. The question I want to ask you is that since evolution, and you talked about evolution, we are continuously evolving.
Yes?
And so, since all of the changes in evolution takes place so far first in Africa, and I believe that we are evolving into even, I don't see how, you can, but even a higher, more complex being. Would we expect to see that coming out of Africa first, and would that be because the original human genome pool is there and it's coming off of that branch of humanity?
Only to the degree that modern Africans are moving out of Africa and carrying their genes with them to other places. We did a lot of work on the genes, spent 11 years on studying the genes that metabolize ethanol. And I think I mentioned on the phone to you that if you have an East Asian, Chinese or Japanese friend, and that friend has a small amount of ethanol, a beer, a glass of wine, one cocktail, they will often turn, depends on the individual, but those who flush will turn bright red because there is a defect that's very common in that part of the world that results in an intermediate product of digestion. Ethanol is turned into acetaldehyde and then into acetate. Acetate is harmless. Acetaldehyde is a poison. But normally the molecules just jump the 2 steps like that. But in East Asia, there's a very high frequency of the enzyme for the second step, digesting acetaldehyde to acetate, is very inefficient or doesn't work at all. So this toxin accumulates, and the flushing reaction is a physiological reaction to being poisoned. And they don't feel good. And that is a variant that arose as a mutation, as far as we can tell, never has existed in Africa. It arose after modern humans arrived in East Asia. And we think there may have been some advantage associated with agriculture because the toxin, if it's a mild case, will also kill some parasites. And you think of rice paddies, walking barefoot, using human feces as fertilizer, sure as hell can be a lot of parasites there.
Absolutely.
And so if this helped decrease the parasite load, that might have made it a little more common, because ethanol in various fermented drinks was undoubtedly present, but it wasn't an essential part of diet. So people who couldn't drink ethanol could survive, maybe even better than those who did drink it, because they could have lower parasites.
Okay.
So that's speculation. We don't know the facts, but it's consistent with all the facts we do know.
Okay.
So that's a bit of evolution
Right.
that seemed to have responded. How the variant arose, we don't know, but once it was there, selection, some sort of advantage existed. So it didn't die out. It actually got to 10% of the population.
But that is similar to environmental changes that the European would have went through from Africa, making that transition into
And it's
a cold
like
climate.
the ability to digest lactose
Yes.
is exactly the same sort
Right.
of thing. Now, there are African herding
That's right.
groups
Some,
who
not
drink
some-
milk,
Yeah.
and they're also adult tolerant, but for a different mutation.
The Zulus.
So it's a different origin in terms of a variant occurring. It has the same consequences, but it arose independently. Similarly, light skin color. Chinese do not have the same variants that make my skin very light. And yet, their skin is certainly light. Now, it may not be as light as mine, but it certainly isn't as dark as a Nigerian's.
That's true. I wouldn't say as dark as me, because I'm not that far from you. But anyway.
I deliberately did not say as dark as you.
I can feel it in. No, but yeah, did you finish? Because I wanted you
Yeah.
to go back to DNA series and why you would have in Africa 9 DNA series, in Europe 6 DNA series, and I didn't write this now, y'all wrote this. The greater the number of DNA series, the greater the potential for genius and creativity. I'm just trying to understand it.
In that context, the series is a set of variants.
Okay.
So you can find East Africans versus West Africans in, if I've got it right, in West Africans you'll find broader noses. In East Africans, in some of the Ethiopians that I've met, their noses are as thin as a European.
Correct.
So those are kinds of series of variants that you can begin to divide the global population into refined groups. Now, it doesn't mean they're not different species, but just as you can say that in general, there may always be an exception, but you're never going to confuse someone from China with someone from Nigeria.
Okay. The way you explain it to me, was, you said to me, that does not mean that all Africans are smarter than all Europeans, which I absolutely agree with. And you said, but if you have 1,000 Africans and 1,000 Europeans, you will get more geniuses from the pool of 1,000 Africans than you would from the pool of 1,000 Europeans. And that was what I wanted to follow up on. And I thought I needed to know what a DNA series was in order to better understand what you were saying.
Well, it's just all of this variation.
Okay.
And it's sort of like the pool of sand I was talking about earlier. Each grain of sand is a different variant.
Okay.
And if you, there's just less variation in Europe. Now, the chances are that you use genius. Of course, there are genetic differences in intelligence. And it, goes way back. I, as a graduate student, and as a postdoc, was very involved in countering the publicity in the late 1990s, late 1960s and early 1970s, with Shockley claiming that Africans were dumber than Europeans. Genetically, inherently dumber than Europeans. And it's just not true. And they're, they were comparing children from very poor families with children from families that promoted education. Now, some poor families promote education, but not all of them. And one school teacher for kindergarten once told me, in this community, a lot of the children arrive and they don't know the words for the colors. They don't know what red and blue and green mean. They don't know that by the age 5. They are not going to do well ever.
Ever?
Probably ever, because so much of the formation of the brain is in response to the stimulation one gets. And the formation means all the neural connections. We don't have enough genes to say that neurons 5,383,022, etc., always synapses with neuron 3 million whatever. We have genes that talk about reinforcing synapses and connections. And if a connection is never used, it tends to fall apart.
That is so critical with understanding why the need for preschool and
Early
training and so forth, because the brain seems to be motivated or stimulated to learn at earlier ages. It's like a sponge. It just sucks in everything. So if you don't put it there, the older it gets, the less it can draw upon. It's almost like this genetic material we're talking about. You could almost make the same comparison.
Well, for instance, children who are raised in a bilingual family learn both languages early on.
Right.
Can switch in the middle of a sentence between the two or not, as is appropriate. They know the difference between the two. It's not a hindrance. By the time I moved to Italy and tried to learn Italian, it's painful as an adult to learn a second language. If you already know two, it's easy to learn the third one and the fourth one. But the brain is not as flexible when you get older.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's a lot of growing concern about law enforcement, and we've got to enforce the law. They're taking kids at 16, trying them as adults, and putting them in jail for life. It's well known the brain is not fully developed at that age. There's difficulty understanding cause and effect and risk. Teenagers are risky. They know intellectually that climbing those rocks they might fall off, but it doesn't get into weighing the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're learning more and more, we, the biomedical community, understanding the brain, it's ridiculous to sentence a 16-year-old to life in prison for killing somebody. Now, punishment? I'm not against punishment. They did it. If it's proven they did it. But in another 4 years, their brains will have matured. They understand what they did was wrong. They're not necessarily a lifelong sociopath. They were dealing with a diminished ability to manage their behavior. I could get into politics at this point, but I won't.
No, we are going to transition into politics if you allow me to ask you a few more questions. That's where I want to go, because race has been used as a determinant to open and close opportunity, doors of opportunity. And that's why I was trying to clarify the 6-strand, 9-strand DNA series. Because as Shockley and white supremacists and so forth have tried to make the world believe that somehow Africans are less intelligent than Europeans or other people. And I wanted to get at that in a way that just leveled the field, because I think it will have a great impact on our ability to open the possibilities of peace in a whole new society, and therefore a whole new world, and actually bring us to a point where we can evolve to a higher level genetically.
I would hope we could do that. I am absolutely appalled at our current political situation in the U.S. The idea that if you aren't a white person, you shouldn't be in this country. If you're not a Christian, you shouldn't be in this country. It scares me.
But your research has unearthed, and I say your research has unearthed, I think we've always known just by the history. That's why I do that piece, World History is an African Story, because it levels the playing field. We're all Africans, and world history is the African who evolved on the continent of Africa and then migrated all over the planet. And all of human knowledge comes through that same mind. And the things that Africans accumulated or did or brought into being before they even migrated into Africa, but certainly by the time the Europeans came back, who are Africans, out of Europe and coming back onto the continent of Africa and seeing when they got there all of these great accomplishments, whether it was in science and technology, engineering, I mean, you know, the Sphinx, the pyramids, all of these things are African creations. Don't tell me I'm running out of. Okay, I'm not. I didn't see how I could be out of film that quick. but can you talk to that again? I want to level the playing field so that.
I don't understand why sub-Saharan Africa did not develop to the level of architecture, science, etc., that Europe and Asia developed. But to some extent, that is true. Europeans arrived and they saw cultures that they did not think had risen to the level that theirs had. And I don't quite know why. It can't be, it's just too much evidence that it can't be inherent. But clearly the climates were different.
Now, I want to make sure we're on the same page. I'm saying that Africans created these cultures. That Africans literally brought civilization into being. And that that Africans went into Europe and were there for thousands of years and had these changes from broad nose, thick lips, dark-skinned Africans to Europeans that later came back over the last 10,000 years. That's the scientific information that I've grown up with, and my studies with Kennth Diop and others point out. And because the first Europeans to come into Africa would be the Greeks. I'm just following the lines of history. So when the Greeks come into Africa around 32 BC, Africans had already built the pyramids and built civilizations and so forth. These were not Europeans in Africa. All of Nile Valley civilization was produced by Africans themselves, not outsiders. European had no civilization compared to what the Africans had.
Right. But, at least in my mind, there's a real question about the northern Egyptian population being of the same origin as the sub-Saharans. I mean, when we were in Egypt, you could see going down the Nile, meaning going south to north, the color shift in the people and the physiology. A lot of that comes from the Greek colonization, which I think was 200 or so BC, earlier,
Right.
when the Ptolemaic group came in. But we also see that coming out of Africa, there was a spread across northern Africa. Now, some of it goes back to the Muslim consequences, but even before then, the Berbers and such were tribes lighter skinned, more related to Europeans than to sub-Saharan Africans. And I don't understand exactly when that transition occurred. We don't have good dating on that. So, yes, they were Africans, but it not necessarily the same strain, if you will, of Africans that were found in Central African Republic, Nigeria, Cameroon, when the various European conquerors came through in 1600s. So yes, there was a very well-developed culture there long before the development of the Greek culture, but not necessarily long before the development of some of the Chinese cultures. They have, we saw a lot of bronzeware in some of the museums when we've toured parts of China that go back 3000 BC at least. So there were, it's not clear that that developed as a direct consequence or developed independently. There's just a lot of uncertainty, at least in my mind. I'm not an expert in that particular area. But once you've got people around the world very similar in intellectual abilities and gradually accumulating knowledge because of language and other things, as you accumulate more knowledge, you've got a better foundation on which to build something more.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And civilizations could have sprung up independently in many places.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in the Americas, though much more recent, the Mayan civilization was very advanced.
Mm-hmm.
They had really good astronomy and timekeeping and a kind of language, certainly spoken, I'm sure, but the various codices that were written, many of which destroyed by the Catholic Church,
Right.
which is a great shame.
I was looking for a picture, which I could not see. It's supposed to be right here, but it is not there. Good friend of mine, Ivan Van Sertima, wrote the book that came before Columbus, which he documents the African presence in America going back 900 BC, the African presence. And the picture I was going to show you was the 2,500 ton sculptures that they did of Africans, broad nose, thick lips. I mean, there's no doubt. And these were Egyptian, actually. And they made up the priest class of America. They brought with them knowledge of pyramids and so forth. And it's not saying that they built them, they influenced the...
I know there are those stories. I'm not sure I believe them.
It's all right. I mean, you know, we agreed to disagree.
Sure.
I wanted to interview you because I wanted to learn from the areas that you are proficient in that I have known depth. But in terms of my research and my studies in African history, I am convinced without a doubt, have been to Egypt many, many, many times with African historians and others in terms of studying. And if you would agree that the Greeks came around 532 BC, all of the golden ages of Africa had risen and fell. At least there was 4 of them. And that signaled the fall, the last fall of Egypt. And until the Suez Canal was constructed in when was the Suez Canal built? All of that area was really, the Middle East came about with the construction of the Suez Canal. But historically, Israel, what is now Israel, all of that was a part of the African continent. And the civilization, Nile Valley civilization, comes out of the south and moves north. And there's so much documentation of that now. It's not it's not speculation, it's just fact. Writing and all that, it comes from Sudan. I mean, when they did the Cousteau, and I went to Chicago to interview the brother who, I call them brothers just because of their search for truth. what's his name? But he was with the original team of Americans, because all people around the world sent teams to try to save villages that were going to be underwater once the Great Dam was built.
Right.
And Keith still headed up the exhibit, but Bruce Williams, I think his last name was a part of that. And after Keith Steele died, Bruce Williams, I think, he is the one who published the findings. So I went to the Chicago Museum to interview him, and what they did was that they found a cemetery that had an incense burner and other, artifacts, and they determined that from this incense burner, because all of the elements that later became Egyptian hierarchy and the religious system, all that, was in existence in Lower Nubia, that they determined from what they excavated from the cemeteries, which had 9 pharaohs. They were not Egyptian then, but they later became the same structure. So the structure was in place in Lower Nubia and traveled to,
Right.
up the, and these were, so you were traveling south, and you're saying the people, as you travel south, become darker and darker. If you travel south into Nubia. But what you see in North Africa has been invaded by Arabs, and 640 Arabs completely conquered North Africa, and the spread of Arabs across Libya, all that area, that did not occur until after the Greeks and Romans. The next phase was the Arabs. It would be good to study some of the works that have been done by people like Sheikh Anthony, who presented at UNESCO and took on the historians of the world. And his work was accepted. It was challenged, but they all agreed that his work was...
Well, one of the things I've learned from the travels that I've been lucky enough to be able to do, is how narrow the history I was taught in school actually was. I mean, we learned nothing about East Asian history, and even European history was very focused on England.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But even if you follow that history will intersect. And if you look at the period that it intersects, all of this other history has already taken place, which, will lay out for you. Europeans are coming into Africa. They didn't build anything in Europe. They didn't come in and build all this in Africa and then go back to Europe and build anything. I mean, it just, when you look at it, if you follow the history, you had primarily wars going on in Europe all the time. I mean, they fought one another. I mean, they didn't do any great. There's nothing of great building historically in Europe like the pyramids, the Sphinx, or the temples up and down and now. All of this is modern engineering.
Oh, yeah.
But historically, Europeans didn't build anything in Europe. And they
Well,
came
in
to
fact,
Africa, and it was all done in Africa when they got
a
there.
lot of Europe wasn't even occupied significantly at the time the pyramids were being built, because the Ice Age
Correct.
had just made Northern Europe uninhabitable.
Yeah, up until around what? How many thousands of years ago? Not that many. I think 7,000s that the Europeans really began to come out.
Right,
of it.
but they hardly reached Scandinavia, for example, or even the southern Baltic until 3,000 or so years ago.
Right. Right. All of that in Africa was done, and it wasn't done by Europeans because Europeans
right.
hadn't reached Africa then. That was black Africans. I mean, you know, they weren't Chinese. They were, but you can find plenty of history of Africans going into Europe, and all of your great universities that come out of Europe actually were formulated by the Moors. So that history all has to come out. So when you said they didn't teach that in school, I'm talking about leveling the playing field. So we got to teach the true history.
Oh, yeah.
Which is why I really wanted to, do this interview with you, because at least on that level, we can agree, we can start even there, and everything else can fall in place.
Right.
And I think when we see that we are all brothers and sisters, we might not think about killing up a bunch of people that we don't know, ain't never seen, for the benefit of some multilateral corporation who wants their oil or who wants, we might begin to understand that the same blood that flows in my veins flows in your vein. And you and I might have more in common than Chase and Rockefeller taking the oil from, we might find that we need a cleaner source of energy so that the planet can survive.
Oh,
We all can survive.
I feel very strongly about that.
This
And
bullshit that's going on with who gonna push the button first, Trump or this is madness.
absolute madness.
This is madness. And the only way we can is that humanity's got to come together.
And madness supporting coal when there is more investment and there is more need for investment and actually more employment
Absolutely.
in
Absolutely.
the clean air energies.
Mm-hmm.
And we're letting China take over on solar panels.
Absolutely.
And boy, when we toured the northwest part of China, it's been 5 years ago, as our car moved out, we passed these huge fields of solar panels. We passed huge wind farms. Now there's not much out there, except we also passed serially, was almost like watching a movie, the way you used to flip cards in front
Yes.
of you.
Yeah.
A huge power tower.
Yeah.
Then there was one almost finished. Then there was a one just starting. Then there was one with all the material next to a concrete pad. Then there was one with just the concrete pad. Then there was one with the excavations for the concrete pad. It was just like a production line. They were moving the power lines out to where these wind farms and solar farms were.
Now let me tell you something. I love America because of its potential. And because I see America as mine. When I say mine, I'm talking about my people. Because we built it. We've never been paid. Never been paid for the years of free labor. And if you have years and years of free labor, like 200 or 300 years, you ain't got to pay nobody, and they do all the work for you. You ought to be the richest people on earth. And all of the labor, cotton was king. Cotton not only made America wealthy, it made Europe wealthy.
Oh, yeah.
We picked it sun up to sundown. See, I picked cotton. It wasn't over when I was a boy. I picked cotton. I picked 300 pounds of cotton a day. So I was paid, but I wasn't paid but $3 a 100 pounds. And that was still slave labor. We did, what do they call it? Where we go out, we do the farm, my people did. And at the end of the year, at the end of the season, we picked the cotton, and it was carried to the gin and all that. And it's supposed to have been 50-50. But the people who my people worked for, after everything was counted up and they took out the books, we always owed them because they owned the store that we bought all of our food. Now, the only good thing that I would say that came out of that is that the white man who owned that land and that we worked for, when he got old and was about to leave here, he did one thing that I really appreciate. He asked my uncle, Tom, he said, Tom, you know, worked this land for me for years and years and years. He said, and there's, the guy that wanted to buy the land, he said, but I don't want to sell it to him. He said, but you know what, Tom? He said, you've been good to me. You want to buy this land? And Uncle Tom, having done nothing in his life but farm for this white man, he said, well, he said, Mr. Jenkins, he said, I don't see I can afford it. Every year when we do the books, I owe you money, so I can't afford this land. And he said, yes, you can, Tom. You can afford the land. What can you give me? And Tom said, well, I can let you take it out of the what we do every year. He said, that's good enough, Tom. You done paid for this land 100 times. He said, we'll do it that way. And so we end up with 350 acres of land. In fact, I own 40 acres of that land today.
Wow.
So, and that's part of why I'm trying to raise a few dollars before I get too old to go down and do something with it. It's been in the family, and we owned a lot of land down south. And I had two uncles that did the sharecropping, and both of them ended up with a conscious old white man who was, at the time, he just decided that he'd sell us the land. So we ended up with two parcels, 350 acres each. And we farmed that land for ourselves for a long time. Then our people started moving off the land because we just couldn't make a living on the land, because racism cut us out of selling our products and everything. And the government wouldn't give us the money that they gave white folk to plow under Because, you know, they didn't want them overproduction of the corn and stuff. So
Right.
they could plow there. They got paid for not farming. We got nothing. And we couldn't sell ours. And so we had to leave the land and come to the city and work in the factories. So that's what my father did and everything. So
I certainly know the broad story and that such. I've never met anyone who lived it personally.
He lived it. Yeah, I was born on and brought up. So I spend a lot of my time just trying to level the playing field. And when I say I love America, this can be a great place. But we're over the cliff now. We're in free fall.
Oh,
And unless we come together, ain't nobody going. Ultimately, they think that they're following Trump, think they're going to end up with making America great again and being like it used to be, but America would never be like it used to be.
it'll take decades.
And only then,
And he's
if we can
done it
eliminate,
in less than a year.
yeah, and only then, if we can eliminate this racism and bigotry, and
Well,
see all of us.
I've learned, I was extremely fortunate. We grew up in a small town, but there were no blacks. It had been, I forget, there's a certain word for it, a sundown town.
Oh, I know. Out of town by sundown.
Exactly.
You lived in one of those towns?
Yes. And I learned only after I left to college how prejudiced so much of my family was. Not my parents. And because there was never anybody to express it on. It was just not there. Until my senior year, there was a story that, about 7 blocks from where we lived, a family was selling their house to a black family. Everybody was outraged. It was extraordinary. And I realized that this was horrible. And because I'd never had any prejudice taught, I was able to come to that realization. And then I moved away to college and lived in the dormitory, and I got a room on the floor where all the football players were living. And they were almost all black and big, huge bulks of men. They were football players, you know. Got along fine. One of them was taking an introductory chemistry course, and we studied together. And he ended up never becoming a dentist, but that's what he wanted to be. His hands were about 5 times as big as mine. They could almost go around a football, not just... He couldn't be a dentist. You know, there's nobody with a big enough mouth for him to be a dentist. You know, and I've often been asked, are there genes for sports? And my response has always been, Absolutely. I don't have them for basketball
Now, I'm
because I'm
serious
only
now.
5'4".
Oh, okay. Yes, all right, okay. I was about to ask you, I was about to inquire if that
Some
was
of the
true.
genes needed for basketball are height.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So of course there are genes.
Yeah.
And I also don't have them for football, as I was just talking. So, but it also takes the training and the mental drive and
Yes.
so on. You look at the good swimmers, they've got shoulders out to here and very slim hips and so on. So when they're doing this, they don't hit themselves. I mean,
No, but that's,
figuratively.
yeah.
I don't have a body to be a good swimmer. I've got enough fat that I float well. But it's, what do you mean by genes for athletics? And of course there are people who have the biological capability of doing well in a given sport. But that doesn't mean they will do well.
Right.
It's just they've got the necessary prerequisites.
Right. Now, Dr. Kidd, I make lemonade, and I think I probably squeeze you like a lemon. And and I don't want to overextend this first opportunity to interview you. I say first because I think we should have an ongoing, I think we should try to figure out how we can work together to make some impact on what I think both of us agree should be an effort to level the playing field. So that
I'm certainly not going to object, but I have a
you
very
busy as
full.
a bee. I know.
I'm trying, deliberately trying to slow down a bit. Keeping up the work is getting harder and harder.
Yeah.
And so we're going to travel a little more, take a few days off. We're thinking my sister would like us to come out to California to visit her. She said, I can tell you what I want for Christmas. I want you to come visit as soon as you have a chance.
You better go.
And so, yeah. And we have been thinking, we wanted to take a few days in January to go someplace warm. Well, if we're in Los Angeles, there are lots of flights down to Cabo San Lucas at the tip of Baja California. And so we might just go, rent a car, drive up to Bakersfield, see my sister, spend 3 or 4 days, come back to LA, turn the car in, and fly down for 5 or 6 days. Just pure relaxation.
Oh, wow. You're making me jealous.
Well, we've, both Judy and I grew up in poor families. And one of my memories, I must have only been 5 or 6 years old. I was very young, but an indication what an impact it meant. my mother drove downtown and parked, and I think she didn't feel she was dressed appropriately to go in a shop, but she needed something. She gave me a $5 bill to go in and buy this.
Mm-hmm.
It cost less than $1. Now this is, of course, 70 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I lost the change coming back to the car. I have no idea how I did it. I know I got it. She was devastated at having lost that amount of money.
Mm.
It was really significant.
Mm.
And that's, how upset she was is something I remember from that very early day.
Mm.
But fortunately, they were very strong on education. Our town had a very good school system. And I did well.
Yes, you did.
And so they couldn't afford to send me to college, but I got scholarships
Mm-hmm.
to college, to graduate school, to go abroad for a postdoc. And Judy also had scholarships until she went for a PhD, which was after we moved to Yale. She enrolled as a regular student in the PhD program there. And I was making too much money for her to get a scholarship. The tuition benefit for me as a faculty member would only apply to my children.
Mm.
So I thought, well, maybe I could adopt her. But I thought, oh, there are laws that might get a little involved. But by then we were making enough money. We paid it. But we've got a frugal lifestyle, even though we're world travelers.
Mm-hmm.
So we've saved up enough money. We're
Yeah.
not worried. We can go down to Baja California for 5 days.
Oh, that's wonderful. I am so glad. I think you should go. I mean, I know you're going, but I'm just...
Well, it's not all signed and sealed, but we're certainly moving in that direction.
Good afternoon, Dr. Kenneth Kidd. It is my pleasure, really, to do this interview with you. And I might say it has been long in coming, but worth the wait.
Well, I hope.
No, just talking to you on the phone is where I pull most of the energy for this interview. So if you would, I would like for you to kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved in this field, genetics.
Oh, it started out when, before I even attended high school, I was always interested in science, and I learned about genetics. The summer before I entered high school was a word I hadn't known before. And then I actually taught myself a lot of genetics out of college textbooks while I was in high school. Had a mentor, doctor that I went to down in Beverly Hills. We grew up in a small town in the central part of California My parents were very poor, but this doctor didn't charge them what he charged Ronald Reagan. It was a doctor who treated Ronald Reagan. But he took an interest in me and said if I really wanted to be a scientist, I'd never be wealthy, but if that's what I wanted, I should find out. He got me a job for the summer in a research laboratory at City of Hope. And I then kept the job for 5 years, part-time during school years and full-time during the summers. Went to graduate school, was very interested in population genetics and in human variation. So I met a close friend at the University of Wisconsin, and one of my earliest papers was with him on the genetic similarities of populations out in the Pacific, Melanesia and the island of Bougainville in particular. Started looking at humans more broadly, finally got a job, recruited to Yale, did other work on human diseases and schizophrenia, depression, because there just wasn't enough data available to really pursue the human evolution and diversity question. And then, lo and behold, DNA polymorphisms were discovered. And I changed my lab and started a whole new course of research in the early 80s. And we've been building our collection of DNA from populations all around the world. So we have a collection of approaching 3,000 individuals from 50 populations around the world. Well, 50 populations is a small fraction of the variation. There are 7,000 distinct languages spoken around the world, and each language can be defined as a group of people that's distinct in some way. Certainly their culture is. But we've just enjoyed it, understanding this diversity and trying to interpret some of it in light of what we know historically and what we know prehistorically. And in the late 1990s, as more DNA data were becoming available, there was a revival of the old hypothesis that modern humans arose in 3 places, in Africa, in China, and in Europe. And from those 3 sources, then they spread around the world. Well, one of our papers was one of the first to provide very strong evidence that that was not the case, that modern humans arose in Africa and then expanded out of Africa. Have to be careful to use the word expanded, because modern humans are still in Africa. It's not that modern humans left Africa. It's just some individuals did. And then how they spread around the world, what the timing was, probably less than 100,000 years. Differences have occurred. Variation has been lost. There's more genetic variation in Africa than, at least at many of the markers we've looked at, around the rest of the world put together. So at one gene we were looking at, there were, I think, 30 different forms of that gene in one African pygmy community. And in all of the non-African populations we looked at, there were never more than 15 altogether. So just one African community at that gene had more variation, almost normal variation, obviously, than all the rest of the world put together.
Now, what is the significance of that, and how does that fit into coming to the reality, or coming to the conclusion that all humans come out of Africa?
Well, the significance is part of understanding population genetics, that when you have a small number of people, you cannot have a lot of variation. If you've only got 20 people, you can only have a maximum of 40 different kinds of a given gene, because each person has 2 copies. Well, you're not going to have all of those passed on to the next generation. You're going to have only a fraction of them. So in small populations, variation is lost. I was talking about one pygmy community, but that's not something that existed separately for many generations. The pygmies migrate all around Africa, so it's really a large population within one village, a sample of that large population that can have all of the variation because they will mate with people from other villages. So it all relates to the out of Africa. That's one of the most significant aspects of recent human evolution. A lot of variation was lost because only a few people actually migrated out of Africa. Now, it may have been 10,000, 20,000, but over many generations, that's a relatively small number compared to 50,000, 100,000 left behind. But one can think of a serial expansion, that a few individuals move out into the unoccupied area, but it's only a few. They have some children, maybe they're there for 2 or 3 generations, and then some of those children move further away. Partly it may be the resources, the game available to hunt. Partly it may be just they're tired of the old folks back home. They want to get away to someplace new, do their own thing. I don't know, but certainly modern humans have that aspect. So probably something like that may have existed 80,000 years ago. You know, we haven't completely invented ourselves brand new from what our ancestors were. They may not have had elaborate electronics, but they certainly had reasonable brains.
Let me ask you, the capacity to think, you said they certainly had reasonable brain. Would you say that Homo sapiens sapien back in ancient times thought as well as any modern human being?
There's a semantic issue there. What is thinking as well?
Well, solving problems and observing the universe around and coming up with its...
They certainly had the ability. Did they have the resources in training?
Mm-hmm.
We think about things now in complex ways. We can consider alternatives. We've had years of schooling. We can observe much variation around. Their environments were complex in a biological and physical way, but not complex in as many ways as ours. But people are finding now that the folk medical remedies take aspirin, willow bark. People knew thousands of years ago that willow bark, chewing it, could help relieve pain. They didn't know what it was. Now the chemical is isolated and we can get purified aspirin. So there are probably a lot of things like that. They undoubtedly learned about fermentation very early. There are examples even of great apes knowing about fermentation. But that's also a way to have cleaner, safer drinking liquids. Certainly recent times, the Middle Ages, very recent compared to 100,000 years ago, everybody drank beer because you certainly wouldn't drink water that would make you very sick because all of the water was polluted. They didn't understand the elements of hygiene and so on that we understand now.
Let me ask you along the same lines, in terms of learning, could it also be that in ancient times there was more of an affinity to nature and I would say a communications, for lack of a better word, where the understanding, it's just like animals are born knowing probably everything they need to know to survive within their element. Could, if you use the word spirituality, and that's, open to, it's an open-ended understanding, could you say that because of their spirituality, their closeness with nature, they had a different understanding of these
Their
things.
closeness with nature, certainly, I'm sure, observation, understanding, hunter-gatherers know what to look for. The hunters know where animals are likely to be and how to track them. What parts of plants are edible or useful for other purposes. So they would understand that, and I think they would probably have seen themselves as part
Yes, that's what
of
I'm getting
nature.
at. That's what I'm getting at.
Whereas today, it's one of the fights we have going on in our society. Conservation, setting aside land, reintroducing wolves into Yosemite, that sometimes get out of the bounds and may kill a calf or a lamb in the farmers nearby, and they cry bloody murder. But it's important to have those wolves around because they keep the deer population down. The deer population is healthier. The forest isn't as overeaten. Everything around is better.
Right.
Because the wolves are there, and yet they don't fit with modern agriculture and modern husbandry. So it's a problem. Things go extinct. Whoever thought the millions of passenger pigeons that were hunted would someday be extinct? There were millions of them. But they hunted them to extinction.
But we could say that about so many species. But I want to throw in another piece on the oneness, the understanding of your oneness with the universe, with nature, and your ability to draw from that information that would give you the ability to do, to create, to bring about complex, say, mathematics. I'm looking at the pyramids, because the pyramids now are said to be about 12,500 years old, according to the work of this German anthropologist. I got his book upstairs. But they're saying that the pyramids are much older. So my insight would be then, could it be that in ancient times, or the further back you go, maybe humanity was closer to nature and the symbiotic relationship with nature and everything around them, and they were able, it's just like George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver, who invented 300 and something elements of the peanut, said that he went out into the forest and he talked with the plants, and they told him. You know the story?
I don't know that story, but it sounds interesting.
And they would tell him things to do. There was a relationship that he had with nature in which he could communicate with them, so he knew which plants to use for different elements and so forth. And he said that nature gave them, that he could communicate with nature. Well, I just wanted to, it's going to take me into a different area, because you said that in our conversation that you were more of an evolutionist than a religious person, and I'm just trying to tie the two in together and see if you can make that bridge, because I went from minister to oneness with nature, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I'm certainly an evolutionist.
Mm-hmm.
Everything in science points to evolution. There are uncertainties about exactly how it happened, but none of that argues against the basic phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at the DNA now at species all around the world, we are genetically closer to plants than we are to fungus. So if you've got some peas on your plate and some mushrooms on your plate, we are genetically related to the peas much more closely than we're genetically related to the mushrooms. And of course, all mammals are closely related compared to birds and many other kinds of animals, going back to, and then to insects, which is, of course, a whole different branch of evolution, but of animals after they came out of the sea. And it's just fact, as far as I can tell. That doesn't, I don't have a particularly strong spiritual sense, but I guess my respect for and in the unity of life might be something you would say fell into that range of spirituality. I think I have a very strong moral sense, and that's also related to the unity of life. It's also related to the value of an individual.
Yes.
Be it an animal, well, of course, humans are animals in one sense, but another kind of animal or another human. And this obviously translates or transitions right into issues of racism and prejudice, etc., that are just nonsense. There is no group of people that is superior to another group of people. They're different, probably. You're not going to confuse a Japanese with a Nigerian. Doesn't mean either one is better than the other. And the differences, I think, are fascinating. and how they arose. And in one talk I gave, and it was unfortunately very misinterpreted by some people. But I quoted the famous phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal."
But not the same.
But then I said, that's a very profound and true moral statement. But it's not a statement of biology. Every individual is biologically unique. You look at any family, okay, all of the siblings may look very similar and similar to their parents, but every one of them is different, just the way they act. Ask any mother who's had 2 children. From day one, when they were taken home, the babies were not behaving exactly the same.
Right.
So this is nothing new or startling. It's just we can now look at it at the DNA level, but the differences we see are a small fraction of all the DNA, just as the differences between you and me some are visible, some are not readily visible, but we're both modern humans.
Let me deal with the cover page of the extract that I got from the work you did with 16 geneticists from different parts of the country. The extract said the greater the number of DNA series, the greater the probability for genius and creativity. Then it gave, and it has the map and where these samples were taken from, which were all over the planet. And it had 6 DNA series for people for Europeans. And it had 9 DNA series for Africans. And it showed where these samples were taken. You can go ahead on and answer that. I'm just going to let the people, I don't know who they are, but I'm going to see it, and I don't want to cut all these cameras off.
Okay.
So you can either wait or you can answer. I can hear you. I'm focusing on you.
How do I want to give a simple example? It's, if you think of a combination of variation that may lead to something in a human that's sort of at the extremes. Let's take Michelangelo and his artistic abilities. Leonardo da Vinci and his abilities to design things, as well as be an artist. That's clearly outside the common range. And that's something that will occur maybe more commonly with some amounts of variation than it will with other amounts of variation. So if there's lots of variation, occasionally those extremes will pop up. If there's not a lot of variation, it's hard to get to the extremes because you don't have the variance that generate those extremes.
Now, I hate I went to that door. I missed something. Can I ask you if you would repeat some of that?
Okay, I probably didn't give a very good example. Let's think of piles of sand.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got a little bit of sand, and you pile it up, and of course it'll spread out a little. But then if you've got a lot of sand and you try to pile it up, it'll spread further.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think that these exceptional people who are, I hate to say abnormal, but they're sort of out of the range. The Einsteins, the Michelangelos, the Leonardo da Vinci's, and one can go on and on. If you have to get out in this far extreme, if you've only got a little bit of sand, a little bit of variation, you can't get out there. Or very few grains of sand get out there. So if you've got a lot of variation that's useful and contributes to these kinds of exceptions, then the chances that some will come together are better.
Okay.
If you don't have all of those variants that you need, you can never pile all of them up.
When I talk to you over the phone, you use, as an example, Scandinavian population, and most of the people in that population are going to look the same. But if you had an African population, you would have more of a variety because of the... Now, I may have taken this wrong, so I want you to correct me if I did. I took it as the African population, because it said that the Africans that evolved below the Sahara, but then I found out they used that because Northern Africa has a lot of Asians and so forth. So the indigenous population would have been African. So it represented all Africa. But because they had more of the original human, and you're going to have to explain this to me, when you talked about polymorphisms and so forth, that they had more of the genetic material that would go back in time to the first or the primer human, and had not over time lost as much of that genetic material.
That's right.
Okay, can you explain it? Because I have a problem explaining that, and I want to get a grip on it.
I'll try. I won't guarantee.
All right.
Yes, over time, genetic variation happens. Mutations. Small changes. Some of them cause genetic diseases. They're very harmful. And those tend to get selected away because a child born with a serious metabolic disorder doesn't live. But lots of other variation may affect very slightly the width of the nose. Now, there's no reason why that would be harmful. And if that variation is still there, that accumulated over time, then you will see variation in the width of the nose. Now, you said African population. There isn't one African population. There are a lot of them. And they differ. Just like a Japanese can tell the difference between another Japanese and a Chinese. I have terrible trouble doing that. Because I wasn't raised tuned in to the very slight differences. But I would argue, extrapolating based on no special knowledge, that one African tribal group can identify individuals from another tribal group, even though I may say they all look alike.
That's true.
Because I'm not tuned into these very small differences.
That's true. All birds, all blue jays look alike, but some blue jays like other blue jays better.
So, I think that's part of it. By the time there's the loss of variation that I talked about expanding out of Africa.
Let me just throw this in here. Could environment, say Africans leaving Africa, going into Europe, and having to survive an environment that was harsh and bitter and cold, develop these variations which are just nature surviving and preparing the people to survive the environment, because they and the environment are one and the same. And nature survives, and it prepares itself for itself to survive.
So, these variations they don't generally occur in response to the environment. They need to pre-exist by chance. And then the environment can select them. So, there's variation in skin color. In Africa, dark skin color helps protect against the equatorial harsh sun.
Correct.
Once you get out of Africa, you're further from the equator. The sun is never as intense. And Lord only knows, these days we hardly get much sun here, much less in a place like Northern Europe. So the variation that decreases melanin in the skin allows more sunlight to hit the capillaries and generate vitamin D. And so it becomes more common. And that's necessary to survive. So there's also adult lactose tolerance that is virtually universal in Northern Europe. I clearly have those genes. In essentially all mammal species, the gene that digests lactose is turned off at weaning as part of normal growth and development, because lactose only occurs in mammalian milk. Now, as you're moving into a cold climate, during the long winter, the cow is in the cave or the hut with you, and the baby needs milk. That's fine. But the parents need nutrition too. If they have a better chance of surviving, the baby won't survive if the parents die, if they can also drink the cow's milk. But in most of the world, the gene is turned off in modern humans. As a Northern European in a very white culture as I was growing up, lactose intolerance was a disorder. We now recognize it as a biologically normal state. We have lactose-free milk because we have a lot of people here who would like to drink milk. It's nice. But they can't tolerate the lactose because the lactose isn't digested by them into simple sugars, but it is digested by all the bacteria in the gut.
Okay.
And that's not good.
Okay. Yes.
So, if I drink a glass of milk, most of the lactose is digested before the remnants even get out of my stomach.
But if I drink it, I may have a problem.
Yes.
Yes. Can you do me one favor? Can you move your chair over a little bit? Our light sources, a little bit more. Our light sources change. Can you move over? Are you comfortable?
Yeah.
Okay. Good, good, good. Now, I'm hoping. No, you want to add something to that?
Oh, I was just going to say, if that's
thank you.
on, it's no longer pointing at me.
You're absolutely right. Generally, I have somebody working with me. What I would like for you to do is, because I'm not sure that, even though DNA is a common, phrase, but I'm not sure we really understand. I mean, there's just a lot of people. I'm not sure if we really understand what we're talking about when we talk about DNA. Everything has DNA. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So, DNA is a recognizable structure, a recognizable particle of the structure of everything. How can you explain it so everybody will understand what we're talking about when we talk about DNA?
Okay.
Is it like hydrogen? Hydrogen is a integral part of everything.
Right. And it's part of DNA. DNA is a in a normal state, it exists in the nucleus of any cell. there's an exception in red blood cells don't have any DNA. It is digested away as the red cell fills with hemoglobin. But it starts out there. And it's very long, and it's composed of repeating units. And it's like a ladder in that there are two strands with connections between the strands. And those connections alternate the different bases, A, T, C, and G. And they pair. A pairs with T, and C pairs with G. The result is the machinery in the cell can pull apart the two strands and build a complement to each one. So wherever there was an A here and a T here, it builds a new strand with a T here and an A here. So it restores the pair. A new backbone is formed. So DNA replicates, and it replicates the information, because the order of those four, it's like an alphabet. Or digital ones and zeros. All of our computers store vast amounts of information with ones and zeros.
Correct.
Here it's 4, A, T, G, and C. So a tremendous amount of information can be stored. And the machinery in cells knows how to read that information. There are special signals that say, this is the beginning of the information to make a protein that acts as an enzyme that will digest lactose, for example. And so it comes in and it makes a single copy, and that goes to other machinery that reads it in sets of 3 letters and adds amino acids to make a protein. And there are all sorts of regulatory material that says up here, well, in certain circumstances, we'll turn this gene on. That may come from the environment, or it could be, okay, this kid is now 5 years old and has started growing longer leg bones. And so now's the time to turn this gene off. So it no longer goes through this machinery to make the protein. So it's the blueprint, if you will. It's the instruction booklet. But not a booklet. It's been analyzed to 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica in terms of the information. Because it makes all the proteins, it regulates